Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I am flying solo today, so I'll be giving you both the Washington report and the call to action. Let's get right to it. The House will be in session from Monday through Thursday, while the Senate will be in session from Tuesday through Friday. Last week in the House came back on Monday and voted to pass two bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House took up and passed H.R. 529, the Extending Limits of U.S. Customs Waters Act. Then the House took up and passed six bills under suspension of the rules. Then the House passed a rule governing floor consideration of seven bills. Then, in quick succession, the House took up and passed H.R. 3397, the West Act, H.R. 615, the Protecting Access for Hunters and Anglers Act, H.R. 764, the Trust the Science Act, and H.R. 3195, the Superior National Forest Restoration Act. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed, by a vote of 320 to 91, H.R. 6090, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 6285, the Alaska's Right to Produce Act. And then something very, very rare happened. The House, instead of defeating the motion to recommit the next bill, as almost always happens, instead passed the motion to recommit when six Republicans crossed party lines to vote with the Democrats to send the bill back to committee. The bill in question was H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, which the Biden administration strongly opposed. Then, finally, after having been bumped from the schedule a few times over the last few weeks, the House took up and passed H.Res. 1112, denouncing the Biden administration's immigration policies. No fewer than 13 Democrats crossed party lines to vote with every Republican for the resolution. And then they were done. This week in the House will return Monday with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 11 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House will consider two more bills under suspension. The House will also take up H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act, under a rule. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will consider three more bills under a rule. They are H.J. Res. 109, providing for congressional disapproval under the Congressional Review Act of the rule submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to Staff Accounting Bulletin Number 121. H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act of 2024, that is, the one that got sent back last week with the successful motion to recommit, and H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act, which we're going to talk more about in just a moment. Last week in the Senate returned on Tuesday and voted to invoke cloture on the nomination of Georgia N. Alexakis to be a U.S. District Judge for the Northern District of Illinois. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm her to that position. Then the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 3935, the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Bill. On Thursday, the Senate voted to proceed to H.R. 3935, the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Bill, and then they were done. This week in the Senate will return Tuesday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the nomination of Donna Welton to be ambassador to the Democratic Republican of Timor-Leste. Following that vote, the Senate will return to its consideration of H.R. 3935, the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Bill. Many think this is the last must-pass legislation that will be coming down the pike for quite some time. Consequently, there are a lot of senators who want amendment votes on favored legislation and are willing to hold up time agreements to get what they want. Negotiating the amendment lineup will be a challenge for Majority Leader Schumer. Now to the border crisis, latest news. Fox News' Bill Melugin reported last week that per Customs and Border Protection sources, on May 1 and May 2, a total of 485 Chinese nationals were apprehended in the San Diego sector, just one sector. 262 on Wednesday and 223 on Thursday. As he put it, quote, that means more Chinese were caught crossing illegally in the last 2 days than in all of FY21, 342. He went on to say, quote, overwhelming majority of the Chinese are mass released as China is not cooperative with deportation flights from the U.S., end quote. CBS News reported 2 months ago that Chinese immigrants are the fastest growing group crossing from Mexico into the United States at the southern border. One of the immigrants told a CBS News producer that to get to the United States from China, some 7,000 miles away, he had crossed through Thailand, Morocco, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. According to the reporter, last year, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported 37,000 Chinese citizens were apprehended crossing illegally into the United States from Mexico. That's 50 times more than 2 years earlier. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in Washington, D.C., on Friday morning, the Biden administration announced a rule that will allow a group of so-called dreamers to access the Obamacare marketplace, despite the fact that when Obamacare was first enacted in 2010, we were promised that illegal aliens would not be eligible for the benefits. Under the new rule, active recipients of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that's DACA, will be eligible to enroll in a qualified health care plan or a basic health plan. Said Neera Tanden, the director of the Biden White House Domestic Policy Council, quote, this final rule also reflects the president's belief that health care is a right, not a privilege, for all Americans, that it should extend to DACA recipients just like the rest of us, end quote. But DACA recipients are decidedly not just like the rest of us. Just to make the obvious point, they are not Americans. They are illegal aliens. Congress should immediately hold hearings to determine how much this new benefit is going to cost, and someone in the House should introduce legislation to bar any Obamacare disbursement to any state providing Obamacare subsidies to illegal immigrants, including DACA recipients. Now to the Equal Representation Act. Did you know non-citizens are counted for purposes of apportioning seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and votes in the Electoral College? That includes illegal aliens. So states that have more illegal aliens are rewarded by being given more political power, more seats in the House, more votes in the Electoral College than states that do a better job policing themselves against an influx of illegal aliens. That's backwards. At the start of this year, 2 freshmen, a freshman congressman and a freshman senator, decided to introduce legislation to fix that. On January 25th of this year, Senator Bill Hagerty, a freshman Republican from Tennessee, introduced S. 3659, the Equal Representation Act. It was referred to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. But since the Senate is currently controlled by the Democrats, the bill hasn't gone anywhere, and I don't expect it to. 4 days later, on January 29th of this year, Congressman Chuck Edwards, a freshman Republican from North Carolina, introduced H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act, in the House. On April 10, the House Oversight Committee marked it up and approved it for consideration by the whole House on a straight party line vote of 22 to 20. On Monday, May 6, that is today, at 4 p.m., the Rules Committee will meet to consider putting the bill on the House floor. The bill makes 2 significant changes to current law. First, it requires a citizenship question be added to the decennial census. Second, it modifies apportionment of representatives and electoral college votes to take that citizenship information into account and bases the allocation of representatives and electoral college votes on citizenship, not the whole population. In doing so, the bill removes the incentive for states to welcome illegal aliens by acting as so-called sanctuary areas, states and cities that don't cooperate with federal law enforcement officials to properly enforce immigration law. As it stands now, with a census that counts non-citizens and an apportionment system that allocates representatives and electoral college votes solely on the basis of the whole population, including non-citizens, therefore including illegal aliens, it creates an incentive for states to allow illegal aliens to come live there, because that brings added representation and therefore political power and additional votes in the Electoral College. In other words, current law actually punishes states that act responsibly to cooperate with federal immigration authorities to remove illegal aliens. That's exactly backwards, and it needs to be changed. The Equal Representation Act would fix that problem. It would restore the proper incentives and disincentivize bad behavior. I have no reason to believe it will have any difficulty getting through the Republican majority House, but I doubt it will get through the Senate, and it would almost certainly be vetoed by President Biden if it did somehow get through the Senate. Nevertheless, it's a great marker of the distinction between the two parties, and therefore it's a good bill to put on the floor in an election year, when drawing contrasts with your opponent is what it's all about. Stay tuned. Now, the latest update on non-citizen voting. On Wednesday morning of this week, a number of grassroots groups, including Tea Party Patriots Action, will join with a number of House Republicans, led by Texas Congressman Chip Roy, to pledge their support for Congressman Roy's new bill, the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility Act, that is the SAVE Act. The legislation would amend the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, to require states to obtain documentary proof of citizenship in order to register someone to vote in an election for federal office. Contrary to what sneering liberals say, the proposed legislation is not redundant because it does not outlaw non-citizen voting. That is already illegal. What the bill does do is require that states obtain documentary proof of citizenship before registering someone to vote. It's one thing to require someone to swear he or she is a citizen, especially when all that is required to do so is that a registrant check a box on a form and then sign his or her name to it. It's quite another thing to require that registrant to provide documentary proof of citizenship in addition to swearing. Making something illegal doesn't mean that whatever you've just outlawed will stop. For example, it's against the law for a non-citizen to cross our border without authorization from the proper authorities. Yet millions of people have done so just in the last 3 years, more than we have ever seen in a similar time frame. Similarly, making it illegal for non-citizens to vote doesn't guarantee that non-citizens will not vote. Making it illegal for them to register to vote without first providing documentary proof of citizenship, on the other hand, would make it impossible for non-citizens to vote to the extent the new requirement is enforced by the states, because the non-citizens would not have been able to register to vote in the first place. And that's why TPPA is supporting this new bill. Now let's talk about the motion to vacate. Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is still hopping mad at Speaker Mike Johnson and still wants him gone. If she is to be believed, she will this week designate her motion to vacate as privileged, and the leadership will be required to hold a vote on the motion within 2 days. I say if she is to be believed because she introduced her motion a month ago, and she has said she has strong support for it among the House Republican Conference. But only 2 other members have joined her in co-sponsoring the measure, and they both added their names within a few days of its introduction, and we've seen no movement since. I will quote to you her reasoning from a tweet she posted on Wednesday. This is a list of what she called Mike Johnson's betrayals. Quote, passed a 2-part omnibus with Democrats and majority of Republicans against it that fully funded Biden's open border, DOJ, FBI with new building, full-term abortion, and trans agenda on kids, and refused to allow us to make amendments and gave us only 1 day to read the over 1,000-page bill. Reauthorized FISA and was the deciding vote against warrant requirements, flipping his position from 6 months ago when he was for warrant requirements to protect Americans. Passed over $100 billion to foreign wars, $61 billion to Ukraine, $26 billion to Israel, $9 billion to Gaza, that is Hamas, $3.5 billion to aiding refugees, bringing refugees to the U.S. from Gaza, that Joe Biden says he wants to make U.S. citizens who will get to vote, but did absolutely nothing to secure America's border, end quote. She says she's going to move the motion because the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, has declared that House Democrats would save Speaker Johnson by voting to table her motion if it actually comes to the floor. We'll see. Of course, what's fascinating about her play is that she says she's doing it because Speaker Mike Johnson is a tool of the Democrats. But her ploy only works if the vast majority of Democrats join her in voting to oust Speaker Johnson, because the vast majority of Republicans are going to vote to keep him in his job. So actually, it's going to be Marjorie Taylor Greene who's working with Democrats against the wishes of the vast majority of the Republicans in the House. Irony, thy name is Marjorie. Now to the latest on anti-Trump lawfare. Former President Trump's illegal bookkeeping case heard its second full week of testimony last week. Before we go any further into this trial, I just want to point out some of the errors I believe Judge Juan Merchan has made along the way. Errors that I think are going to be litigated on appeal if the former president is found guilty. First, it is a black and white rule in the law that if Jim and John are both indicted for a crime they allegedly committed together, and Jim is convicted, the fact of that conviction cannot be introduced at John's trial as evidence that John is guilty too. Yet that's precisely what happened in this trial, when Judge Merchan allowed Alvin Bragg's prosecutors to tell the jury in their opening statement that former Trump Organization attorney Michael Cohen had been convicted of federal campaign finance violations for his role in the conspiracy they described. Not only did the judge allow the prosecutors to share with the jury information about an alleged co-conspirator's guilty verdict, the judge also allowed the prosecutors to allege a conspiracy to do something that's not a crime, even though under the law, a conspiracy is an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime. That is, you cannot be guilty of conspiracy to do something that is not a crime. Yet Judge Merchan allowed the prosecutors to use that exact language in their opening statement, describing what they were going to prove, even though it wouldn't have made any difference if they had, because what they were alleging was a conspiracy, was not an agreement to commit a crime. Further, the judge made a decision not to allow former President Trump's attorneys to bring in as a witness former Federal Election Commission Chairman Brad Smith, who has written many times about how engaging in a non-disclosure agreement is not a campaign expenditure. A campaign expenditure is an expense that occurs as a direct result of the campaign and would not occur were it not for the existence of the campaign. For instance, polling or advertising or paying to rent a hall to hold a rally. None of those things would have happened, and no money would have been paid for them if there hadn't been a campaign. On the other hand, buying a new suit to look good on the campaign trail is not a legitimate campaign expense, because professional men need to buy and wear suits anyway. Similarly, paying someone to keep quiet is not an event that is unique to a campaign. Celebrities sign non-disclosure agreements all the time. Therefore, it's not unique to a campaign, and it is therefore not a campaign expense. Paying for it is not an in-kind contribution to the campaign. And because paying for it is not an in-kind contribution to the campaign, paying more than $2,700 for it, that's the legal limit in 2016, that was not an illegal campaign contribution. Here's another way of looking at it. Imagine what would have happened if Trump had directed that campaign funds be spent to engage the non-disclosure agreement. Then we would have had a mess on our hands, and the Trump campaign likely would have been fined by the Federal Election Commission for improper use of campaign money. More interestingly, this question has already been litigated. Following the 2008 campaign, in which former North Carolina Senator John Edwards was a candidate for president, federal prosecutors charged Edwards with campaign finance violations for taking money from a donor to engage his mistress in a non-disclosure agreement. The jury in that case did not agree with the federal prosecutors that the Edwards hush money scheme was a violation of the law, and the jury hung. The feds declined to file new charges against Edwards. So the precedent is clear. It's not a violation of federal campaign finance laws to engage a mistress in a non-disclosure agreement, especially if you don't use campaign funds to do it. And if it's not a violation of the law to engage in a non-disclosure agreement with a woman you impregnated, as Edwards did, how in the world can it be a violation of the law to engage in a non-disclosure agreement with a woman you say you never engaged in such a relationship with in the first place? Perhaps that's why, when federal prosecutors were looking for something to charge Trump with, they examined the hush money case and passed on it. And so did the investigators at the Federal Election Commission, the federal agency authorized specifically to enforce federal campaign finance law. To this day, it's mind-boggling that Cohen agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of illegal campaign contributions. The only reason that makes sense is that at the time he chose to plead guilty, he was trying to make himself attractive to federal prosecutors as a witness against Trump. He was hoping that by serving as a witness against Trump, he would serve less time for his convictions on tax evasion. So he agreed to plead guilty to a crime that had never been adjudicated before, and which many smart campaign finance lawyers argue is not a crime in the first place. That's just some of the stuff this judge let the jury hear that I don't think he should have let the jury hear. We'll see if Trump's lawyers agree with me when the case is over. Now let's talk a little bit about the latest happenings on the 2024 campaign trail. 2 things of note on the 2024 presidential campaign trail. First, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is running an independent campaign for president and has achieved ballot status in California, Michigan, and Utah, and claims to have satisfied the requirements for ballot status in several other states that have not yet confirmed it, held a press conference to deal head-on with the argument that his candidacy is nothing but a spoiler, and that the better he does, the greater is the chance that he ensures the election of Donald Trump. Kennedy said he is not a spoiler and that he's actually doing better against Trump than Biden is, and therefore Biden is the one who should drop out of the race, not him. Quote, "We only have one chance to beat Donald Trump, and we need a nominee who can get the job done, and that would be me," unquote, he said to the assembled press corps. He then challenged Biden to take what he called a no-spoiler pledge and join Kennedy in promising to withdraw from the fall campaign if he were to perform worse than Kennedy did against Trump in a national survey to be taken in October. Kennedy then showed polling data that indicated that he did better in a head-to-head matchup against Trump than did Biden. Quote, "Is there any scenario in which President Trump participates in the election and doesn't win it? Yes, there is exactly one," Kennedy said. And that scenario is that President Biden acknowledges that he cannot win. Spoiler alert, Joe Biden isn't about to drop out of the race because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. challenges him to. If he won't do it when 2/3 of his own political party has been telling pollsters for more than a year now that that's exactly what that 2/3 majority wants him to do, why would he do it when a guy who isn't even a Democrat anymore demands it? The second thing of note that happened is this. The Republican National Committee met in Florida over the weekend, and at one point, pollster Tony Fabrizio and co-campaign manager Chris LaCivita of the Trump campaign delivered a presentation on the electoral map. The Trump campaign believes there are really 3 maps in play. Each of them begins with the same basic assumptions. There are 19 states plus the District of Columbia with 226 votes that are likely to go blue, and 24 states with 219 electoral votes that are likely to go red. And you have to remember the 2 states that apportion their electoral votes by congressional district and statewide popular vote. That's Maine and Nebraska, and we have to flip 1 vote from Nebraska's 5 blue and 1 vote from Maine's 4 red. That's the basic starting point for all 3 maps. 226 votes for Biden, 219 votes for Trump. Remember, you have to get to 270 to win. The first map they discussed is the media's map. That's the basic map that we just discussed. It leaves 7 states as the battleground states. They're in 2 tiers across the country. The northern tier is the 3 Rust Belt states that have been battlegrounds for quite a long time. Pennsylvania with 19 electoral votes, Michigan with 15 electoral votes, and Wisconsin with 10 electoral votes. Then across the southern tier, Moving from east to west, you have North Carolina with 16 electoral votes, Georgia also with 16 electoral votes, Arizona with 11 electoral votes, and then Nevada with 6 electoral votes. The second map they showed is what they think are the real battleground states for the fall campaign. And guess what? The Trump campaign believes it's already put away the southern tier and has confined the fighting to the Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If you put the 4 southern tier states into the Trump column, he's at 268, just 2 electoral votes short of victory. That means that winning any one of the 3 northern tier battleground states would put him over the top. Then they showed the third map, and jaws dropped. The Trump campaign's high command believes it's possible that 2 more states could be put in play. We call them reach states because putting them in play would be a real reach for a GOP campaign. The 2 states are Minnesota with 8 electoral votes and Virginia with 13 electoral votes. Now, Virginia makes sense. From 1968 to 2004, for 10 straight presidential elections, Virginia was a solid red bloc, as safely Republican as Oklahoma or Wyoming. But then in 2008, it flipped blue, and in the 3 elections since then, it still hasn't come back. But in 2021, a Republican won the governorship. So Trump strategists think it might be in play if Biden's approval ratings continue to hover in the low to mid 40s. The Trump team says it tested multiple ways in both Virginia and Minnesota. In Virginia, Trump's internal data shows Biden leading Trump 40 to 37 in a 6-way contest that includes Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at 8%. In a head-to-head matchup, Biden leads Trump 48 to 44%. And in a 4-way contest, Biden's lead is just 1 point at 42 to 41%. Minnesota has been beyond reach for Republicans for decades. In the last 12 elections, going back to 1976, Minnesota has voted for the Democrat candidate for president, even in the 1984 wipeout of Walter Mondale by Ronald Reagan. In fact, during Reagan's Morning in America re-election campaign, Minnesota was the only state that voted blue. And that was only because the Democrat candidate, Walter Mondale, was from Minnesota. And Reagan was a gentleman and told his campaign team to stop the advertising in Minnesota in time to let Mondale win his home state. But the polls in Minnesota today look favorable for a Trump flip. In 3 public polls taken in 2024, Biden leads by 42 to 39, 42 to 38, and 44 to 42%. That's a toss-up if those polls are accurate reflections of what's going on the ground. Trump's internal data shows basically the same thing. In the 6-way contest in Minnesota, Trump and Biden were tied at 40% each, with RFK Jr. at 9%. In the 4-way contest, Trump leads Biden by 5 at 46 to 41%. In a head-to-head matchup, Trump leads Biden by 3 at 49 to 46%. Now to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 64 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped on Wednesday. This week's episode features Jenny Beth's discussion with Roman Buehler, who's heading up the Keep 9 initiative to prevent the progressive left from subverting a fair judiciary system by overturning more than a century and a half of settled law by expanding the number of seats on the Supreme Court until the left can achieve a majority. It's a very instructive discussion and highly recommended. And that's our Washington Report for this week. Now to the call to action. You might think it's illegal for people who are not U.S. citizens to vote in our elections, and you'd be right. But you'd be wrong in thinking that those who want to corrupt and subvert our elections haven't been able to poke so many holes in the law that there are plenty of opportunities for non-citizens to vote in our elections. The stark reality is that the 2024 election could be swayed by illegal votes cast by people who are not U.S. citizens. This is an enormous violation of the rights and privileges granted to us by our status as citizens, and it's a grave problem that must be solved. And it can be solved by patriotic Americans like you. There are different ways we can prevent non-citizens from affecting our elections. We can get out the conservative vote. We can serve as poll workers and poll watchers. There are other things as well. For all the details about why it's true that non-citizens are able to vote and how to stop it, please read through a document put together by our friends at Election Integrity Network that you can read and find on our website at teapartypatriots.org. You'll notice that there are suggestions for actions the federal government needs to take, actions the states can take, and actions that you can take at the local and state level. This campaign, for now, will direct emails and calls to federal and state officials. However, please go to our website at teapartypatriots.org, download and read the document on the non-citizen threat to find out what you need to do locally. As always, if you've got any questions, you can reach us by sending an email to jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And if you want me to answer a question about something you've heard on this broadcast, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. Thanks for tuning in. Until next week, be well and be active.